morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's lovely to see you all this morning. We have with us today, doing our Good Shepherd in the World, offering up a little bit about storytelling and poetry, Bishop Brian Cole. So you know, for those, we have a few people at home who asked, and so we are Facebook Living this. So there are other people tuned in. And Bishop Cole, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to see you all that are here. I'm going to open with a sacred reading from John Lennon's song, Nobody Told Me. You all use this occasionally here, I'm sure. Nobody told me there'd be days like these. You repeat that. Nobody told me there'd be days like these. You repeat that. Nobody told me there'd be days like these. Strange days indeed. Most peculiar mama roll. So these are strange days that we're living in, and I'm grateful for the ways in which you all as a parish are navigating these. I'll say more about that in the sermon as it relates to today's gospel lesson, but I think the main thing is, we're living through strange days, and we're living in a time. This is not the end, but these are apocalyptic times in that they reveal things about us, right? They reveal our strength, they reveal weaknesses, they reveal and they clarify things for us as well. So my hope for us as a diocese is this will clarify who we are as God's people, not break us, not diminish us. And so there's some things we've done financially in the life of the diocese to support parishes. I'm grateful for the ways in which you all have been working on your building in this time. In the midst of the pandemic, had a chance to come and bless the chapel. I love that chapel. I don't know if you've had a chance to sit in that space. It is a prayerful space. It has a hum to it, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for Amadori, for Father Rick. I'm grateful for your vestry, that you're raising up folks like Bo Davis for the diaconate, for being who you are. Also, you're welcoming folks from St. Thomas Church. Last year when we closed St. Thomas Church, one of our deep commitments was to find church homes for the folks that had been a part of St. Thomas, that in the midst of closing that church that we not lose people or that they feel lost to us. So I know that you have welcomed some families here. Thank you for doing that. Also, I would encourage you to treat this time, every parish in the diocese as a new church plant. That I think we're living in a time when a lot of folks are going to say to us, what does this mean? What's going on? How do I make meaning out of this time? My hope is they'll find places like you, and that not simply find you, that you'll find them. Be open to seeking them out. When Dory mentioned storytelling, I knew the story I wanted to read to you. I think it's one of the most fascinating stories from Scripture as a way of jumping off and thinking about what it means for us as God's people to tell stories, to hear stories, to tell them again, to hear them again. So if it's okay, I'm going to read to you the passage from the Gospel of Luke, the Emmaus Road story. I'm going to set it up a little bit in case you don't know the story. Come on in. We're glad you're here. So the end of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus has been crucified. Jesus has been raised from the dead. And Jesus has appeared to some of his disciples. And now we're moving towards this story, the Emmaus Road. So this is end of day of the resurrection morning, okay? And here's the story. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, again, remember this is Jesus saying, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. but we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels, who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? The beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures." So when I think about this story in the whole understanding of storytelling, what's remarkable is these people are telling Jesus about Jesus, right? So when he comes up to them and says, "So what are you talking about?" And they're like, are you clueless? You know, like, where are you from? You know, like, are you the only person who doesn't know what everyone is talking about? And I love the fact that Jesus doesn't cut them off and say, "Oh yeah, I'm Jesus," right? And cut the story off. And why I think this story is important for us to read and to read again is it also impacts what we do as storytellers in the Christian tradition now. A thing I learned early on as a parish priest was to not assume I already knew stuff that I thought I already knew, right? So you're new in a church and you've heard a story about the old, whatever the thing was, the thing of glory or the thing of decline, the scandalous thing, the wonderful thing. And I learned early on, and I learned this by mistake because I assumed I knew the story, right? What's your name, sir?
Roy.
Roy. So Roy comes to see me, and Roy plops down as Roy is, you're a plopper, right, Roy? You look like a plopper. So Roy plops down, and Roy says, "Well, you know, I assume you know about the old, you know, vestry scandal of 1997, right?" And if I'm not that swift, I say, "Yeah, I do." If I'm really paying attention the way Jesus is paying attention in the story, I say, "No, Roy, tell me about the old vestry scandal of 1997. And I hear the story again, right? And I think one of the reasons why it's so powerful for us to read Scripture in worship and read it again, and read it again, and read it again. In this case, when we read Scripture in worship, even if we're reading the very same words again and again and again, what we hear will differ. If Kay is preaching, or if I'm preaching, or Amadori, or Father Rick, according to who's preaching, what we say we see, what we see will differ. It's the same story. But in particular, to think about the story of a community. Again, those stories of joy, those stories of stress, that when we cut ourselves off from those stories, I mean, if Jesus had said to them, first of all, he'd said, "Hey, it's me, it's Jesus," you know. So right there, he wouldn't have heard, because a part of what's happening in this lesson is they're telling him the facts as they know it, and they're beginning to try to make meaning of what the facts mean, right? So he's hearing them begin to do a kind of theological reflection. This is what happened, and this is what we think it meant. And so Jesus listens to them. So there's something really powerful when you listen to someone's story, right? When you don't cut them off. "Oh yeah, Roy, I already know about that story." Because then you lose an opportunity to make a connection, right? Because so much of storytelling is making connections. So, and I've also learned too, young people now don't know about Columbo, right? And I finally learned to stop saying, "Well, you just kind of go in there and ask the dumb Columbo question." It just, you know, yeah, you have to explain there was this television show, you know, it's too involved. But, so it's not that we treat people sort of like the dumb Columbo. I don't want to catch Roy in a lie. You know, it is truly just, it's just, I have an interest in hearing you tell the story, right? Because in the telling of the story, probably what I know or I think I know will be clarified, right? I mean, I've learned this as a bishop, right? There's all these stories I have been told about East Tennessee from place to place. And either I've been told that about clergy, about parishes, about ministries from the past, about Grace Point, you just keep going. The stories I already had been told when I got here. And what I've learned is, when I listen to someone tell me the story again, sometimes it's the same story. So it doesn't always shift dramatically. But I learned then who holds which stories with high regard, right? So when Kay comes to see me, the stories that Kay's going to tell me about the life of the diocese tells me something about Kay's ministry. Or what you tell me about Good Shepherd tells me a lot about Good Shepherd. I'll never forget being with you at Christmas Eve. Was that the 50th anniversary, Christmas Eve?
Yeah.
And the whole idea of people worshiping here that first year. See if I get this right now. This is a quiz bowl, right? I'm going to see if I can get it back to you. So I was here for the 50th anniversary Christmas Eve service. And that first Christmas Eve, you all worshiped in this building, or worshiped in that nave, but there were no windows. So sort of indoor, outdoor, right? Sort of you had the open air, but you had the roof down, right? But you had the, right? So whenever I think of Christmas Eve now in East Tennessee, one of my real images is Good Shepherd that very first year of what it would have been like. You're in your new building. You don't have the windows. There might have been a breeze going, maybe a little snow. And I have a story in my mind of Good Shepherd at that year. And I got to tell you, it's a warm story. It does my heart good. It's a lot of joy. But I'm curious if someone had told the story who was there that night. I'm curious if somebody would have been put out the windows were supposed to be here 3 weeks ago. Junior said he was covered up and said he's going to get it done. He didn't get it done. That's why Junior's a Methodist now, right? I mean, we all shunned him out of the building. But it's that sense of, I've got a story in my head, and I have given it so much meaning. And I love that idea of y'all Christmas Eve with those windows out. But anybody who was actually there might have thought, that does it. Next week I'm with the Presbyterians. It's according to who's telling the story and what captures you. So what I love about this story, again, is Jesus is willing to let someone else tell Jesus about Jesus. Because in some ways, if you and I are to see in each other the Christ, and a part of our call is to tell the story of Jesus to others as we understand it, you and I are constantly doing this. We're constantly being invited to tell Jesus about Jesus, right? So the story of Jesus and me, when I relay that to Roy, or vice versa, I learn a lot about how Roy has encountered Jesus. I learned how I have encountered Jesus and what kind of Jesus I encountered, right? Was it grace? Was it mercy? Was it love? Or was it fear and rules and falling short? We learn a lot about what we've been told or what we've held on to. So to me, the process of storytelling, and knowing that in East Tennessee, we live in a part of the world where we have the International Storytelling Festival. We say this is in our bones, that we are people that tell stories and know how to listen to stories. So to me, all the more that to think about how this Emmaus Road story that we hear, that Jesus is modeling for us, I'm going to hear a story, not only that I know, but Jesus knows at a deep level, right? Jesus was there as they're telling this facts about him and trying to make the meaning out of it. And then he responds to them, he helps them understand the story, and he gives the meaning, he gives the interpretation. I think as believers and as Christians, we're particularly called for this kind of vocation. When I was a kid, I was a big comic book reader. Loved to read Batman and Spider-Man and all of those characters. And one thing I loved about those stories was that I was in the know, right? That Spider-Man's actually this nerdy high school kid named Peter Parker, right? Or Batman's actually this dashing millionaire, multimillionaire, but at night he's the Batman. So what you think you see is not as it seems. So that when I first encountered clergy detective stories, anybody read clergy detective stories? So Father Brown, or maybe if you watch PBS, Grantchester with Sidney Chambers and all that wonderful red hair, or to be fully inclusive, Marilee Watkins, who's a female deacon, or Mother Claire Ferguson. I used to think of clergy detectives almost like superheroes, of like, how could a clergy person be a detective? Isn't that like Peter Parker and Spider-Man? But increasingly I realized every clergy person is a detective, right? I mean, a part of our work as clergy is we listen to stories. Remember the first time when I was ordained bishop, like my first day of work, I said to Susan, I'm going to treat this whole thing like one really long Grantchester episode, right? I'm just going to go out there and just start writing this stuff down, right? It's going to be one really long Grantchester episode. And I mean that in a delightful and positive way. That a part of my job is to observe people, just to watch, and to notice what you notice, to notice who tells the story, and to how they tell the story. And this is what's really important in storytelling, especially storytelling of a community, to let people surprise you, right? First time you hear about somebody, maybe that it's good to kind of have the thumbnail sketch, right? If you have no thumbnail sketches can be exhausting. So you kind of get the story. Remind me of your name.
Heidi.
Heidi. I'll never forget knowing that Heidi had been a Marine, right? So I have a lot of respect for Heidi, right? So in investor meeting, I'm going to always be aware that Heidi was a Marine, right? So I'm going to give her an extra space, right? So that dynamic of, I know something about you, but I'm also going to let you surprise me. A good detective does that, right? And so in the Christian story, in a Christian community, that being open to being surprised by each other, right? Not put Roy in a box. He's a plopper, but he's more than a plopper, right? Or to let people surprise us. Because if we don't do that, again, it becomes that rigid kind of storytelling. The story that's no longer living and active. It becomes that dead letter, right? I've described Roy, and that's the end of it, period. Because if I believe I can change, right? The whole part of the Christian story is I can change, I can repent, I can be transformed, I can take on this amendment of life, I can become a new person in Christ. If I believe I can change, then I need to hold that belief for others, to allow people to surprise me and to be surprised by people. For you, when you think about Good Shepherd, is there a story of Good Shepherd that you either have heard forever, told forever, that if I was to come in here as the bishop, and you were to say, well, Bishop, I'm sure you know about, besides the Christmas Eve without windows, is there another story about Good Shepherd that is the story that people need to tell and hear again and again? Yes, ma'am.
Most people in this room have come since we had flea market.
Flea market.
But we had an enormous flea market for years and years, and built on it, had the basement full of stuff, which we had to get out and figure out where to put it. Either in this room, or in this room and all outside. And there were, not everybody in the congregation showed up to do something, but everybody in the congregation probably told people to come, and it was a huge thing.
Was that a once-a-year thing? Was it
a once-a-year thing in the spring, and everybody in Fountain City knew about it.
Okay.
And I still have people,
When are you going to do that flea market again? Right? Yeah, you said no? Yeah. So for a while, that story is a story that animates the life of Good Shepherd, right? And I think so many parishes have those stories. And what's interesting, what's important, and this is where I think to think about how storytelling and the Spirit connects, that at some point the flea market ceased to be. Either we just wasn't a need for it, everybody got tired, we sold everything, all the above. And so a couple things can happen. We can either somehow think that story is the story of Good Shepherd, period, stop, so we cease to be, or, and I learned this, I lived in Berea, Kentucky for a few years, and for a while I was no longer Baptist, not yet Episcopalian. I was in this halfway house of hanging out with the Quakers. And what I loved about the Quakers, the Quaker tradition, is they have this idea of, I'm gonna screw up the phrase, sort of, they would have these sort of clearing committees. So Rick comes with a question, a concern, and realizing sometimes, like the flea market, that the Quakers would sort of say, and it's more than just we think it's run its course. They have a phrase for this. They have this really great spiritual phrase that would say, almost like, this thing is done, but it's, again, it comes with a more sacred phrase than that. And I had never heard that before. Because I think I had always lived in Christian traditions and Christian communities of so much obligation, right? We've got to find some poor neck sucker to be in charge of flea market, right? And the next guy that we receive into the church, he's in charge of flea market. So Jason, you're in charge of flea market. And you're in charge of flea market till you find the next guy, right? So that's how we do evangelism here, right? Flea market swap. So that's one thing we can do at times, right? Is those things of obligation. We got to keep this story because we've always done this. If we're not the flea market, who will we be? The healthy thing, and again, there's going to be grief with that, right? Because everybody loved flea market, or that's what they told us. But at some point, to be open to the next story. And I think that's the powerful thing about healthy communities, to think, what's the next story going to be? Right? What's the next story going to be? And I think for Jesus, as he keeps calling new people, and you see this particularly when you read Luke and you keep going into the Acts of the Apostles, so much of the Acts of the Apostles to me is a refreshing book to read. If you're ever anxious about the church, if you're ever anxious about Good Shepherd, or anxious about the Diocese of East Tennessee, or anxious about the Christian tradition, just read the Acts of the Apostles and know that anxiety is baked into the whole shebang, right? Where's this thing going? Well, we heard Paul's doing it wrong, right? He's doing it wrong. He's letting these people come in and they're not doing the introduction to the Jewish tradition course. He's letting them just skip all that. He's doing it wrong, right? He's not telling them about flea market. People are becoming Christians that don't know about flea market. They're wringing their hands, right? And so much a part of the Acts of the Apostles are these news stories. That along with the stories we're going to keep telling about Jesus, a part of what we do is we also tell news stories. So and this is why what's been one of the tragedies about COVID and our distance from each other is so much of how we tell stories. It's not just the preaching. The preaching is a way that we tell stories. But it's so much the informal telling of stories, the swapping of stories. Because that's where you get the real moments of, hey, have you heard about this thing? And the person's wise enough to say, no, tell me. That's where you really learn those informal connections, right? Of what really animates you or animates me. And then we learn how how the new stories get woven and come out of the old stories. There's a poem I want to read to you, and I'm sorry that I didn't bring this with me as far as copies. Anybody from North Carolina? Anyone from North Carolina? Okay. There's a great North Carolinian poet from North Carolina who's deceased, named A.R. Ammons. He has a poem, Poetics. I'm going to read it to you. So, Poetics. I look for the way things will turn out, spiraling from a center. The shape things will take to come forth in, so that the birch tree white touch black at branches will stand out, wind glittering, totally its apparent self. I look for the forms things want to come as, from what black wells of possibility, how a thing will unfold. Not the shape on paper, though that too, but the uninterfering means on paper. Not so much looking for the shape as being available to any shape that may be summoning itself through me from the self, not mine, but ours. That last little section. Not so much looking for the shape as being available to any shape that may be summoning itself through me from the self, not mine, but ours. Too long for a bumper sticker, but a really great way to think about where we are right now. I'm going to send you this, that way if you want to share it with others. What I love about this poem, in this moment, be it COVID, be it climate change, be it the future of the church, be it the public square and our ability to speak to each other and listen to each other, so many things right now feel fragile. And we live in a time with the 24/7 news cycle when something happens and we turn to the pundits and we say, what does it mean? And by God, they're always able to tell us what it means. Too often what it means is it fits neatly into the worldview that the pundit already possesses, right? So instead of necessarily being incredibly able to interpret it, they've really, in many ways, this is the bishop's bias, sort of taken that event and said, this event and the way I choose to interpret it is going to fit the way that I see the world. What I love about what Ammons is saying is, it's less about I'm already going to shape the thing, is I'm going to try to stay open to what the shape is that is emerging, which requires a whole lot of, in the storytelling of, I don't know where this story is going. I'm not sure where this is going. The people who started Flea Market, see, here's what's wonderful about these things. The people who started Flea Market, after the first year might have said, Imogene, I don't ever want to do that again, right? But nobody heard Imogene say that. And by the time the next year came around, Imogene had forgotten she even said that. And said, my God, let's do Flea Market till Jesus comes back, right? That so often what we're supposed to do in the story of Jesus is hold on to the story of Jesus, but to hold lightly onto all the other stories, right? Bo Davis, growing up, was a so-and-so, right? Out in Cleveland, wasn't worth shooting, right? And now he's some kind of preacher. So you gotta hold on to that story lightly, right? Because if not, we put people in boxes, right? And that's your story, end of story. And what I love about Ammons, if Ammons was a poet, if we actually ever went to poets and said, you know, this national calamity has just happened, we're now going to turn and ask A.R. Ammons, the poet in North Carolina, to tell us what it means. We never do that, right? And yet so often, if we did that, what would happen, right? The poet at some point would tell us what it means, but they would have to look at it for a long time, right? They'd pay attention. They'd look, and then they'd really look. This week, on Wednesday night, we ordained 2 deacons. And one thing I said to them, because so often when we think of the diaconate, we think of sort of Energizer bunnies for Jesus, right? Like how many things can you do for the church this week? And I think it's a false understanding of the diaconate. It is a call to service. I think it's first a call to listening and to looking. And for me, the most amazing story in Scripture around looking is the story of Moses and the burning bush. And you all remember the story of Moses and the burning bush? Raise your hand if you remember the story of Moses and the burning bush. What's your name?
Bobby.
Bobby, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but you're on the spot, okay? So tell me, just from your take, tell me about Moses and the burning bush. So what do you remember about that story?
Um,
There's no way to screw this up, by the way.
I'm
Okay.
glad.
No way to screw this up.
He just, he had the faith
Mm-hmm.
to, I'm not sure I remember the whole story, but
And this is where you can phone a friend. You want to phone a friend?
yeah.
Rick, tell us about the burning bush.
Really,
So Moses was in the desert,
yes.
and he was, or the wilderness, I think they call it, and he was, I think, shepherding the sheep of Jethro.
Oh, this is good. This is good, Rick. You're going good. Keep on going.
Okay.
This is good, Rick.
And he's of course fled from, at this point in the story, it's many years since he's fled from Egypt because he killed a man, remember? And then
Just to watch him die. That's
Yeah.
Johnny Cash. I'm sorry. Yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
just to watch him die.
Just to watch him die.
That's right. And he suddenly looks at a bush. He sees a bush that's burning but not being consumed.
Yeah.
And I think he approaches the bush, if I remember right.
Mm-hmm.
And from the bush, I believe there's a voice, but I
Yeah.
can't remember exactly. And the voice says that he is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob.
So let's stop it. Let's give a hand clap for these two. Come on, y'all. Come on, y'all. Come on. The thing about the story, they did a great job, by the way. The thing about the story is, it could have gone different, right? Moses could have seen a bush burning and kept on going, right? Nothing to see here. Bushes catch fire in the wilderness all the time. Just learn not to burn, sort of thing. And the fact that because it says he turned aside, so that meant the bush was burning, but he decides, I'm going to really look at this thing. When he really looks at it, it's burning and it's not being consumed, which requires him to look and then to really, really look, right? So to me, to think about the stories we tell, the stories we hear, the stories we receive, what I love about Ammon's poem is that before we decide we know what the story is, we need to keep looking for where the shape is actually trying to go, right? As opposed to deciding where it's supposed to go. And we've all had these experiences, right? We have some great experience. We do some event. We have a flea market, right? I'm going to stop picking on the flea market. But we have a flea market, and sometimes we have to decide, are we called to do the flea market every year for the next 300 years? Or was that the Spirit moving that year, and now what's the next thing? Because I think what's happening right now in the life of the church is, I think for many, many years, what worked for many, many of us in the life of the church is there are things we did, and the sense was we should do this forever, right? The jamboree, or you fill in the blank, the mission trip to the certain community. And the sense was we should do this all the time. It's sort of it's that kind of programming world, right? Which fit a certain moment in time and fit it really well. Made a lot of sense. But for me in parish ministry, before becoming bishop, and even more now as bishop, I think we're in a moment of really lightly holding on to story. Of there's the thing that we do, but then the real need for discernment of, so will we do this again? Or was just the Spirit moving in that one moment? And are we really called not so much to programming, not so much called to permanent programming, but to sort of improv, right? Sort of ministry is improv. We have that one event, we have that one mission trip, we have that one outreach project, we do that one thing, and maybe we're done. And maybe that's all we're called to do. Because I don't know if you've noticed in our culture right now, but I think we thought with COVID it would cause us to rethink our calendars, right? We'd slow down. Actually, some folks didn't slow down at all during COVID, right? Rick, did you slow down during COVID?
Not much.
No. Yeah, so some people slowed down, not at all. But even for some of us, if we found ourselves slowing down during COVID, we are so attached to the idea that if we're constantly overbooked, somehow that means we're doing it right. So the idea of the permanent programming increasingly, I think, is hard for the life of the church because of the way in which culture shapes us. So more of the story, people, spirit show up for the moment, and the sort of improv approach might be what we're called to now, as opposed to the story is the story and has to be received and told the same again and again and again. Is there some other story about Good Shepherd that I need to know that for you is an important part of, maybe an important part of Good Shepherd now, an important story that you'd want me to know as the bishop about who you are?
Family promise.
Family promise. Yeah, your connection to family promise. Say more, and again, see, I sit there like I knew the story. So tell me the story about family promise.
I think the thing about family promise is that we do it out of love, and we do it well, and we invite other people to participate with us. It's not, this is Good Shepherd's thing, and we're the best, and we're going to keep it all to ourselves. We have involved other groups that are looking for something, and they have found it through family promise. I think that's been an important part of our church over the last few years.
Good. Good. So you're open to something, open to sharing it with others. I've also learned in ministry, sharing a ministry is such an important part of how we do ministry, right? I think for me, the idea, even for me, if I ever talk about my episcopate, it's kind of silly, right? I mean, I can only be a bishop with other people. So even so the whole idea of my ministry, I think, if I had an air horn, I mean, they're kind of disruptive, but if I had an air horn, when people said my ministry, I think I would use the air horn to say. And again, that's abusive. But just to say, really, all ministry is shared, right? So the idea that you're honest that we share this with others, to me is incredibly healthy, as opposed to, oh, well, we need others to help us. So no, it allows the ministry to grow when we share it with other people, as opposed to, if it's my ministry, if it's somehow if we are preparing Bo to be a deacon for his diaconal ministry, then we're misunderstanding that ministry. It's a shared, for all of us, it's a shared ministry. That's really healthy. Some other Good Shepherd story that you'd want me to know? If you were telling us.
We have Martha's Kitchen.
Marcia or Martha? Martha, okay.
Martha's Kitchen. I'm not in it anymore, but we feed people that don't have to be members of the church. Whoever needs food, and fish also, but Martha's Kitchen takes meals.
Mm-hmm. Is that a weekly thing or a monthly thing?
Every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks. Okay, so a feeding ministry to feed others. Okay. Okay. So, so again, just the poem from Ammons, what I love about it is, I think we as Christians, and I opened with the idea of the John Lennon song, you know, these are strange days. So these are strange days, right? And I have kidded that when you all called me as bishop, you didn't mention pandemics, right? That was not in the search profile. So these are moments when we can feel overwhelmed. So if you're feeling, if a part of your story right now is you feel overwhelmed, or you feel paralyzed, or you feel angry, or you feel deep grief, or you feel deep fear, you're probably in the story as you're probably, you know, in the story that many of us are in. And I think this is where it's so important. It's helpful for us to then tell stories as Christians, right? Part of the story that we tell the saints is, in some ways, to allow us to say, oh, we've had these moments before, where it feels like all is lost, or all is falling down, or is anything going to hold? And it's not so much that we take comfort from other people's grief, but to say we've been here before, and that the story of the church is always wondering then about the next shape, right? And to be open to what the shape that's arriving. If the Spirit is still moving, and how might the Spirit move now? How might the Spirit move next? How might, I mean, a part of last year in closing at St. Thomas Church, you know, to me there was some sadness around that, there was grief around that, but there's also been resurrection around that, new families who have found you. And so part of grafting that story into your story, we are taking the ashes from that memorial garden and we're reworking our landscape at Diocesan House. And those ashes will be at Diocesan House, and we'll rededicate that space, and dedicate that space and recommit those ashes. That the shape of what looked like coming to an end really has been transformed, and hopefully a blessing to this parish and you all to them. And so I think this is why we need to keep telling our stories, listening to our stories, and allowing this moment to not overwhelm us as much as this moment hopefully clarifies who we are. That we are a people that continue to believe the Christian story. In all of these moments, God is present. And as we tell stories to each other and listen, realizing just like those clergy detectives, we keep asking the question, what's happening here? Right? What is happening here? I know we're close to the end, but I want to make sure you all have the last word, or what hasn't been said. What do you need to say?
We had a fish program here.
A fish?
We have a fish program
Mhm.
here.
Mm-hmm.
Feeds about 30 families every month. Someone had to be in charge of buying the groceries, making sure we could get money somewhere to buy the groceries. And we did that for a long time. We retired.
Okay. Well, and that's all right. That retirement is that's that sharing of ministry, right? That we pass things on to others as opposed to holding on to them just by ourselves. Any other last words you want to offer each other? Yes.
As people come back, they are going to be amazed at, if they're coming back, I mean, the new people won't know the difference. But the time gave the men in this church who are skilled at rebuilding and doing things, changed the whole thing as far as how it looks.
Mm-hmm.
We can see out the windows because we have new blinds. I don't know that everybody will notice that, but that happens. The bathrooms have just all kinds of new switch. The sanctuary has new switch. The hallway has new switch.
So I'm a big believer in place and space. I'm a big believer in place and space. And obviously we have to think about our buildings appropriately. We don't make them idols, right? We don't. But I think when I notice churches that pay attention to their spaces and how welcoming they are to newcomers and welcoming to folks who've been there. You know, when Dory, when we had a chance in the pandemic to bless that altar and to see those chairs and to see the stained glass, and to me, because in a time where, yes, we can Zoom from ever, but also to say, because I think in a moment where things can feel so fragile, to still say there are spaces that we dedicate as sacred spaces for people to feel safe, to seek refuge, to pray. To even in this space, just for this to be a warm, welcoming space, says something about, again, our ability to pay attention. To what story might emerge in this space if it's been renewed, if it looks new, if it feels new. Right now, we'd always welcome you to come out to Diocesan House. We put on a new roof, and we learned that the house was built without gutters. It was an interesting choice. So we have new gutters, and we're trying to pay attention to that space and think about, again, what new thing will emerge in that space. So I applaud you all for caring for the building, and because again, it allows people to have a sense of we are here, and we are in that regard a new church plant, which means we're open to a new story, right? Of the people who will join you, and what story might they tell, and what story might they need to tell. Okay. I believe we're now at the end of our time. Is that right? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Also, have folks been thanking Lou Ann for all this recording you've been doing? Okay.
Ruth Ann.
Thank you. Oh, Ruth Ann, I'm sorry. Ruth Ann, I need to apologize. When I look at you, you remind me of Lou Ann Duckworth from my hometown. So that's why. See, it's an old story, an old tape. You are Ruth Ann. See, I need to allow your story to evolve. You're not Lou Ann Duckworth. You are Ruth Ann. Go in peace.
Thank you.